Hey, good morning, everybody. I just finished my walk with my soul sister, love Tanya. I'm in Malcolm X Meridian Hill Park, one of my favorite parks. And I was thinking about death, loss, and grief, and how I am choosing to embrace thriving mindfully with death, loss, and grief. And one of the first ways that I am transforming my experience with death, loss, and grief is by looking at what's my personal history with death, loss, and grief. And so when I talk about personal history, I'm talking about what's my first experiences with death, with loss, and grief. What are the stories that I told myself as a result of death, loss, and grief early on? And this is like a longer conversation that I'll be having on my podcast. So today I'm just really throwing those questions out to see how can looking at my personal history with death, loss, and grief, how can that inform how I move forward? And one of the things that I know that has worked with me is that when I take a moment to pause and reflect and to examine where I've been, become mindful of like where I've been, how did I get there, I am in a better place. I'm grounded in a better place of looking at how I want to move forward. And so the personal history of death. I'll give one story. When I was maybe 6 or 7, my mother Teresa was working as an organist, as a choir director for St. Joseph's Catholic Church. And she was playing the organ for a funeral. And so she had to bring all 4 of us to the service because that's what, I'm going to sit for a second. That's what she had to do. So we're up in the choir loft, because at the time St. Joseph's had a choir loft, and she's playing the organ. We're looking down, and in my memory of this funeral is that it was a funeral that was wild for me. It was the first funeral I had been to. It was wild because people were hooping and hollering and screaming, and all in the aisles they were expressing their grief, mourning in their own unique way. But I didn't know that at the time. There were people touching the body in the casket. There was a lady trying to get in the casket. It was something that I thought it was a TV show. I thought they were performing. You know, I'm a kid. I was raised Catholic. We didn't have emotional services or services where people express themselves like that. No judgment. This is just what was happening. And so I started laughing, and my mother quickly told me to be quiet and explained later that this was not a performance, that this was a funeral and that someone had died. And after that, I breathed in what society was saying about death. 1, people didn't talk about it. 2, it seemed like it was scary. 3, it seemed like when people died, there was all kinds of struggle and fighting going on, because my mother's sister, my Aunt Phyllis, had made her transition, and there was a lot of stuff I didn't understand, but I knew that there was a whole lot of stuff. There was a lot of things going on as a result of her making her transition. And as I grew up, I was afraid of death. And I didn't want to go to funerals. The first funeral, the first death that I had to confront in my life as a young adult was my Aunt Pauline. And she was like a second grandmother to me. And I didn't go to her wake. I went to the funeral and I sat in the back and I left right after that. I didn't want to see the body. I didn't want to remember her like that. 3 years later, my grandfather, John Leonard Leake, who was everything to me, that was and still is in the spiritual world, he made his transition. And I did not want to go to the wake or the funeral. My mother told me that I needed to go to one to support my dad and my grandmother. So I went to the wake and sat in the middle. Didn't go up to the casket, didn't want to see him. And it would take me many more years until about 2003 when I started working in Howard University Hospital as a artist in residence for Smith Center for Healing in the Arts with cancer and HIV/AIDS patients that I began to face my fear of death and have to deal with it. And after 15 years of working both at Howard University Hospital and Walter Reed Military Medical Center, and working with patients, working with their families, facing some of the patients making their transition, sometimes even working with them on art projects right before they made their transition. Or I remember one woman at Howard University Hospital, she was living with cancer and HIV/AIDS, and she was a young mother, and she wanted the room to be prepared so that when people came into the room after she passed, it would reflect positive vibrations. So I remember preparing her room with positive affirmations that she wrote and different positive collages that we made. And it was through the arts and serving others as an artist in residence that I started to step into a different relationship with death. I wasn't really aware of it, but that's what was happening. One key thing that plunged me into facing my fear with death was the passing of my best friend, Dino Moss. We co-wrote what would become my first novel, Love's Troubadours. And when he suddenly made his transition, his wife Marcy asked me to read the obituary. Now, I did not, that was one funeral that I know I needed to go to, I wanted to go to, but I didn't want to go to. I had so many conflicting thoughts and feelings, and I did it. And I also went to the funeral, to the cemetery, and watched his casket, stood there. And Dino passing was a big, big, big moment for me, participating in that process, and I'm so grateful that I did. I began in 2003 to shift my relationship with death, loss, and grief. That's my personal history. And it wasn't until the pandemic that I realized how much I feared dying myself and my parents dying. And during the heyday, I don't want to say the heyday, during the early years of the pandemic, because I still think it's going on, I used the support of a therapist and some coaches and spiritual and creative and healing communities to dive deep into these fears. And it was because I made a choice to shift my relationship with death, loss, and grief. the choice was that I wanted to be able to honor the death of my parents and any other loved ones, family, friends with an ancestral reverence. I knew that I would more than likely need emotional and mental support and that I would use my creativity. But I knew I needed that kind of support. I want to encourage you to explore what your personal history of death, loss, and grief are. Just take a moment to think about that. Ask yourself, what is it? And do you want to shift that history and those stories to something different as you move forward? That's what I wanted to offer today. I'm going to share more on my podcast, so look out for the podcast coming soon. I want to invite you, if you want to explore death, loss, and grief, if you're struggling with death, loss, and grief, join me for the Grief in You Retreat series. It's a monthly retreat series that I'm offering beginning March the 17th from 2 to 3:30 p.m. via Zoom. That's 2 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can go to anandaleek.com/events to learn more. All of the information is there. Thanks for tuning in. Have a beautiful, beautiful day. And I'd love to hear what your personal history of grief, personal history of death, personal history of loss, and or all three are. Have a great one. Bye.